guys, welcome back to my channel. Simone here. Today is a little bit of a different background. I'm just trying something different out. I'm sure I'll probably be back to where I was before. There is some stuff on this unit behind me. Please ignore that because, well, you know. Today I wanted to do a slightly different video. I wanted to make a video about the fantasy books that I would recommend. I don't really read fantasy as a massive kind of like, you know, it's not like my main genre in any way, and I haven't read lots of it, but I do think that I have read enough now to be able to recommend a good few to you. So I have 10 today. I do tend to read less high fantasy. I do tend to read more kind of slightly fantastical. There are a few exceptions to that, but yeah, I wanted to kind of give you a few in case you're interested and you want to know which fantasy books that you think you should pick up. So the first one is The Giver by Lois Lowry. I read this a couple of years ago and it's really, really short, so it won't take you any time at all. And there's also a movie which is quite good as well. Actually has Taylor Swift in it. That was a bit of a weird moment when I watched that and thought, hang on a minute, I've seen this woman before. The Giver is set in a world where everybody has the same, they have to do the same things at the same times. They don't really have like opinions of their own. They get given kind of jobs at a certain age, and basically the main character in this, I honestly have forgotten his name, is given the job as the giver. So there is only one giver and he goes to work under this giver in order to become the new giver. Can you say giver one more time in this sentence? So yeah, so he then becomes the giver, and essentially the giver holds like the memories, I think, and so he learns all this stuff, and I mean, there's so many different things to this, honestly. It's really, really good. I think I gave it a 3-star when I read it, but I do think that it's interesting. It definitely has that fantasy kind of element to it, in terms of it's like a dystopian future, I guess, and yeah, it was really, really interesting. Definitely a great read, and I think I read it in one sitting as well, so always a good one, especially if you're looking for a book for a readathon. That's always a good one to pick as well. The second one I wanted to talk about is Truth Witch by Susan Dennard. I picked this up because of my stand-up to the TBR. I think it might have even been the first one that I did. In this world, there are people who have different affinities. So I believe the main character is a blood witch, and that means that she can sense emotions in people. And then the other one is a truth witch. But that is quite rare. So basically, there are people out to get them. And I don't really want to say too much else because it was a massive surprise reading this because I didn't know what I was getting into. I do believe this is a series. I think there's another, I want to say there's like 3 plus like a prequel or something. So I am really looking forward to continuing on the series. I really, really enjoyed Truth Witch. My third pick is Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson. You may know last year I read this book and absolutely loved it. It was in my top 10 of the year. In fact, one of Brandon Sanderson's other books was also in my top 10. But I read this not really knowing what I was getting into because I tried to read one of Brandon Sanderson's other books and I really did not enjoy it, and I just thought he wasn't an author for me. And then I read this one and it completely changed my mind. And actually this one, Steelheart, made me read The Final Empire, which was probably my favourite Brandon Sanderson book, but not by much over this one, because this one is Steelheart is the first in a young adult superhero series. I think it's a trilogy, and the first one is follows David, who is a young boy who lives in a world where there are epics. Now, epics are people who have these superpowers, and they kind of control the world that he lives in. Epics are not necessarily good. In fact, they just want to control the human world, and they use these powers that they have to do that. Now, one day, David's father is killed by this epic named Steelheart, and he watches it happen. He's there when it happens, and basically he makes it his kind of mission to kill Steelheart, or to get him back for what he did to his dad. And in doing so, he meets a group called the Reckoners, who are the only group that have ever managed to go against the epics in any way. And it kind of goes on from there. It's really wonderful. It's not a book that is difficult to understand, because I found with the other Brandon Sanderson book that I read, I found it really difficult to read. The one that I DNF'd, I can't remember what the name of it was. It was The Way of Kings, I think it was. And I just didn't like that at all. But I have now read The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, which I understand a lot, and I think it made more sense. So hopefully The Way of Kings may be more accessible to me now. But generally I would just recommend Brandon Sanderson in general. But I feel like the Steelheart is a good one, and I think it's more underrated than like the Final Empire one is. So I would say check it out. Also, it's much shorter. So if you want to try his writing but you don't want to read like a 500-page book, then that was the one for you. Next up, I'm going to recommend a book that I think that Charlie and Emily are going to like shout at the screen for, because I know they both hate this book, but I actually really enjoyed it. So I'm going to talk about it anyway, and that is The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. Funnily enough, just as I've said that, Emily has just texted me. It's just popped up on my phone that's sat over there. I will get back to her later. It's like she knows I'm here. Basically, The Time Traveller's Wife, and now I can understand also why they both have issues with it, so I'm not saying at all that it's unfounded, but personally I could kind of, I still got enjoyment from it. Basically, it follows a man who, called Henry, who is a time traveller. Now, he is an involuntary time traveller, so he just sort of randomly, at points that he isn't aware, will turn up in another time. Unfortunately, when he turns up in another time, he's completely naked and then has to figure out what's going on around him and what time period he's in. It follows his love story with a lady named Claire, who, I think the issue that Charlie and Emily had was that Claire, he first meets Claire when she's 6 years old, and he's obviously naked when he turns up. However, the whole point is that he's met her when she's older and fallen in love, so then they go back to that time, and obviously he knows who she is, if that makes any sense. It is really difficult because this is a kind of love story in a random order, like it's not from the very beginning of her life to the end, like it's kind of about different things. Also, I should say, Henry doesn't age when he time travels, obviously at the point, so when he time travels back to that time, he's the age he is before, if that makes sense. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I think it is a lot all over the place. There's lots of different time periods and it is quite difficult to track at times. I still really enjoyed it personally. I do, like I say, understand why they didn't, and it can be a little bit weird when he's turning up naked and she's like 6 or something, but I could see past that, I guess. But I know it is kind of a weird one. Personally though, I still really enjoyed it. I think I gave it a 4-star, I think. But yeah, I would say give it a try, but if you can't get past that bit, then yeah, it's probably not for you. But otherwise, I would say give it a go because I enjoyed it. Next up, we have Marked by PC Cast, which is the first book in a massive series. I think I've read maybe 2 or 3 of them now. I do think I would continue reading them in the future. I don't know that they're a priority for me though. This basically follows a world, it's a vampire book essentially, and the main character has been marked. That's what happens in that world when they get to a certain age, I think it is. If they get marked, it means that they're going to be a vampire. So it's kind of like vampires are kind of normalised in the normal world, but basically she then goes to this school, the House of Night, and she essentially goes there to be the vampire that she's going to be, except she's got these kind of, you know, powers or abilities above and beyond the expected of her type, I guess. So I love her grandma in this. She's like my favourite. She's kind of oldie worldy and I absolutely love her. She's brilliant. I think it is a series that's fun. It is a vampire series, so obviously some people won't like that. I did enjoy it. It's not scary really in the slightest. There were a few bits that, I think the second book or the third book, I was a bit like annoyed about something that happened in it, but the first book was great and the friendships between the main characters are just wonderful. So yeah, it's definitely a good series in my opinion. Number 6 is Wild Magic by Tamara Pierce. I read this again last year, I think, and it was one of my favourites of the year. It's a really short book. It's a middle grade fantasy book that follows a young girl named Dane who has this affinity with horses or with animals in general. So she gets a job as the royal horse mistress, and then it's about her coming to terms with her magical power and having this kind of like animal affinity, but it also follows lots of other different types of magic and lots of things and battles, and it's so good. When I first started reading this, to be honest with you, I was completely unsure if I was going to like it. I think I reserved this in the library and it took like a year for it to come through because I think someone had not returned the book to the library, and then when they did eventually return it, like I say, about a year later, eventually I got a random message like, oh, this book's in for you, and I was a bit like, I haven't ordered a book, and then I realised which one it was and I was excited about it. So when I read it, I was kind of like, I can't not read this now. I mean, it's been waiting for me for a year, and I'm so glad I did read it. I do need to keep going with the series. I think this series is the Immortals series, but yeah, I've heard good things. I think that it's a 4-book series, and I know that Tamara Pierce has written so many other books, and yeah, I'm really excited to get to them. Number 7 is a book that is not massively when I say this is fantastical, it's not kind of heavily fantastical, so I think this is a good one to start with if you don't really read fantasy very often. This one is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. This is an incredibly emotional story. It basically follows a young boy whose mother is dying of cancer, and it's him, he has these dreams, or this massive tree comes to him in the night and tells him 3 stories and is trying to get him to tell his truth. And yeah, it's really sad. Obviously his mother's dying of cancer, which is really horrendous, and it did make me cry, and books don't tend to make me cry very much, but this one really did. But there is that fantastical element of a tree is coming to him in the night, like, so there is a slight fantasy element. It is very slight, like I said, it's not kind of, you know, hit you in the face fantasy, but I did really enjoy this one, and I think Patrick Ness's writing is amazing. I have read a couple of others of his, in fact no, I think I've only read one other of his more than this, which I didn't love, but this one definitely was worth the read. And again, it's really short as well, so it's also a great one for a readathon. Just bring the tissues. Next up is a book that I wish more people would read, and that is The Scorpio Races by Maggie Steelheart. I always hear people talking about The Raven Cycle, which I have not yet read, so I can't really comment on that, and I'm sure it's a great series, but I wish people more talked about The Scorpio Races, because I read this one and I absolutely loved it. It basically follows a young girl who is living on this island where every year there is a horse race where these wild horses come from the sea, and they sort of try to capture them and then use them as their steed in the race. And all these men tend to sign up for this race every year, and there's a big money cash prize at the end. And this young girl essentially lives with her older brother and her younger brother, and her older brother wants to move to the mainland because they have no money because both their parents died, and they're living in a house essentially where living just the 3 of them, and he wants to go to the mainland in order to you know, earn a wage essentially and be able to look after the family. So she decides that she's going to enter this horse race in order to be able to get the cash prize essentially, and then be able to keep her family, you know, together. And it's a beautiful story. I love the main characters in this. The brother and sister, I can't remember their names if I'm totally honest, but the brother and sister, the 2 younger ones, their relationship is fantastic. It's absolutely beautiful, and the love interest in this is great, and I just love all the characters, and it felt really real to me at the time. Obviously I can't remember their names now, but at the time I did. I would love to reread this at some point as well, because I think it's amazing, and if you haven't read it, I would definitely recommend that you read it because it's amazing. Next up we have The Host by Stephanie Meyer. Stephanie Meyer is an author who obviously wrote Twilight, and a lot of people have issues with that. However, The Host, for me, the first time I read it, I DNF'd it. I hated it. I read a bit of it and really didn't like it, but then I reread it more recently, and I really enjoyed it. I think I gave it 3 or 4 stars. It wasn't my favourite book of all time, but it is definitely a great read. It is an alien book, and I haven't really read many alien stories, but this basically follows, it's from the perspective of well, I guess it's kind of a dual perspective in one way, because it's essentially an alien named Wanderer who takes over the body of a woman named Melanie. And in the world, basically, if the alien takes over your body, normally the human host sort of dies, I guess, inside, like the soul dies or whatever. But for some reason, Wanderer has been put into this body, and her host is fighting back and is refusing to let go. So then Wanderer then starts to have the same memories that Melanie has, and so she starts to fall for Melanie's like boyfriend or love or whatever, and goes off to try and find him and her younger brother. So it's really interesting. There is kind of that love story in there, which I really enjoyed, but the whole premise is fantastic, and it is a bit slow at times because it's a big book. It's about 600 pages, I think, but yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really well done, and like I said, there were some issues, but I could see past them basically, and I think that it was still a great read. And then the last one is actually one of my favourite books of this year so far, and that is 3 Dark Crowns by Kendall Blake. This again is like a magical story. So this follows 3 sisters who well, this follows triplets basically who were all born to the Queen, and basically what happens is once they get to a certain age, they each have to essentially fight to the death in order for one of them to be crowned the new queen, essentially. So at the age of about 6, I think it was, all 3 princesses are taken separately off by different people, and they are raised completely separately, and they each have a different affinity. So one of them has the affinity of poison, so they are able to eat any poison essentially, or ingest any poison and not die. One of them has the affinity for animals, so has like is able to bond with animals really well, and the third one has this like an elemental kind of power, so she's able to use wind, earth, rain, that kind of thing, and fire, should I say, and kind of use that to her advantage. And then it goes from there about what happens, and the relationships in this are wonderful. I really enjoyed the magic. I thought the magic was really good, and yeah, it's definitely an interesting book. I know that there's more in the series, so I am looking forward to continuing. Again, it's the #1 in a series. Who knows how many of those I've got that I've not continued, but anyway, yeah, I look forward to continuing this series because it is great. I wanted to talk about my video shout out for this video, and in true form I like to try and match up the video a little bit at least, and so today I wanted to talk about Regan from PeruseProject. Now Regan has a big booktube channel, so you know, this is probably a name you've all heard before, but I really enjoy her channel, and so I'd love to shout out people I love, even if they've got much more subscribers than me, or many more, should I say. I love Regan's channel. She's a big fantasy reader, so again, very apt for this video. She really likes to read kind of high fantasy, and she definitely reads more high fantasy than I do. She's an American booktuber, I believe, and she's just very, very clever. I love listening to her talk about books, and even though, like I said, she always gives me good like recommendations for books. She loves Brandon Sanderson as well, which is always a positive from me. So yeah, go and check out Regan's channel if you haven't already, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I shall see you in my next video. Bye guys!